Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue now our reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. Yesterday we concluded with the first paragraph on page 370, and we'll continue where we left off yesterday. He says, Pope Leo XIII, lays down his premise with such assumed authority as not to admit of challenge, and logically argues from it certain satisfactory conclusions, without pausing to inquire whether the premise itself is true or false. In this respect, he imitates some logicians who seem not to realize the difference between assumption and proof. For example, he insists that Christ established an independent church and a dependent state, so that the former does not exist in the latter, but the latter must exist in the former, in its condition of dependence. In other words, that church and state are united, and the state is completely and totally dependent upon the church. And the church rules supremely, or rather the Pope rules supremely, both over the church and the state. That was the old world order. He says he overlooks the fact that states existed before the church, and that instead of interfering with the temporal affairs with their temporal affairs, in other words, the temporal affairs of nations, Christ paid tribute to them and recognized the independence of each in its own proper sphere, the one spiritual and the other temporal. The spiritual obedience he exacted was to the divine law, in order to promote the spiritual welfare of individuals and consequently of society. The temporal obedience was to make secure the political rights of citizens, including those of persons and property. He did not consider states as capable of rewards and punishment in another life, but as mere aggregated communities who could bring them to an end by abandoning their territories. Therefore, he left the state to its own temporal government, independently of the church, and not only obeyed its laws himself, but enjoined the obligation of the same obedience upon his disciples and followers, that is, of rendering, quote, unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, unquote. Now, he gave equal independence to the church, so that by administering to the spiritual welfare of individuals, the temporal welfare of the state would be advanced, and the common prosperity the better secured. And thus, by also rendering, quote, unto God the things that are God's, unquote, the general welfare of the state would rest upon firmer foundations. History, during all the ages since Christ, well attests the character of his plan. For more than 500 years, the church and the state acted independently of each other, neither encroaching upon the sphere of the other, and Christianity progressed until paganism disappeared before it. When the ambitious popes brought on a conflict that separated the Western and the Eastern Christians, and accepted the crown of temporal dominion from Pepin and Charlemagne in consideration of the pontifical ratification of the former's treason to France, the world was plunged into the darkness and stupor of the Middle Ages, and they became enabled to employ their power of absolute monarchism to compel obedience from the state to the church and the Inquisition, to produce unity of religious faith. When the cloud of popular ignorance became so dense as to be scarcely penetrable, and such popes as Alexander VI could assert their own infallibility with impudent impunity, and burn at the stake those who denied it, the necessity for reform became so urgent that the period of the Reformation was ushered in with such violence that the papacy, even aided by the Jesuits, was powerless to arrest it. And when the Reformation gave birth to Protestantism and enabled it to culminate through the influence of free religious thought in the civil institutions of the United States, such impetus was given to the liberalizing spirit of progress that monarchism in both church and state would be hastened to its final decay, were it not that Pope Leo XIII has thrown the great weight of his Christian character into the scale in favor of it and against the progressive spirit which has advanced the world to its present condition of prosperity and happiness. Those who advise us to turn back from this prosperity and happiness, to turn back from Protestantism, I will add, toward the Middle Ages, under the pretense that they are produced by the triumph of irreligion and licentiousness over Christianity, are, to say the least, counselors of evil, says R.W. Thompson. Those who say that we should abandon the Protestant effects of the Protestant Reformation and the liberty that we gained from the papacy because of the Protestant Reformation, those who say that we should abandon all of that and go back to papal servitude are counselors of evil. Counselors of evil. That's what that's a label that R.W. Thompson would attach to every ecumenical evangelibelly that surrendered to the papacy during Vatican Council II, and those who remain counselors of evil, suggesting that all of Christianity should unite with the Roman Catholic Church. Counselors of evil. And that they are. Counselors of evil. And of course they use the flowery words, people like Tom Friess are dividers and not uniters. But I would not abandon Christ to unite with Antichrist. If that makes me a divider, then I'll wear the title gladly. Pope Leo III reasons within a narrow circle, or rather within a number of circles, reaching always the same conclusion, that whatsoever is adverse to the papacy must be opposed until it is put out of the way. His spiritual power must be as comprehensive as he desires to make it, including whatsoever of the temporals he shall decide necessary to its free exercise, or to the interests of the Roman Catholic Church. And within this circle, his jurisdiction must be so full, complete, and independent that neither governments, nor communities, nor individuals can place any limitations upon it or violate the rules and principles he shall prescribe without heresy. He is always explicit upon questions concerning the relations between the Pope and the government, never losing sight of the idea that he must be absolutely independent of them, so much so that while they must obey him when he shall think proper, in behalf of the Church and religion, to command their obedience, he shall be under no obligation to obey any of their laws which he shall consider in conflict with his pontifical plans or the interests of the Roman Catholic Church. Quote, he must be free, he says, to communicate without impediment with bishops, sovereigns, subjects, in order that his word, the organ and expression of the divine will, may have a free course all over the earth and be there canonically announced. Unquote. Here again, he gives prominence to the idea that he is the only interpreter of the divine will, coupling with it the additional one that not only bishops, but sovereigns and peoples everywhere must recognize and obey it. For obedience is necessarily implied, inasmuch as his commands would not have free course without it. No government must possess the power to prohibit this, because he acts canonically, that is, his decrees, being an embodiment of the divine will, become part of the canon law, which, having thus the stamp of divinity upon it, must be universally recognized and obeyed, no matter what governments may do or say to the contrary. Practically, it is the same as if he had said that the laws of all the governments, touching matters embraced within his papal jurisdiction, must give way to the canon law because they are human and it is divine. There are many methods of illustrating the effects of this papal doctrine which will occur to intelligent minds, but at this point one is sufficient. In the United States, we have separated church and state and based our civil government upon the principle of toleration for differences of religious faith. But by papal decrees and the canon law, all this is declared to be heresy and placed under the pontifical ban. Hence, the sovereign spiritual power claimed by Pope Leo XIII gives him the divine right, in the face of all our constitutions, national and state, to anathematize the heretical form of our institutions and to impose upon all who recognize obedience to him the obligation to oppose this heresy and to eradicate it whensoever it is expedient to undertake it. Okay, R.W. Thompson just described every loyal Roman Catholic as a potential fifth column for the eventual overthrow of the Constitution and Protestant institutions of this country. He says, involved in this there is also the claim of additional power to reconstruct our government so as to unite church and state. Reconstruct the government, overthrow the Constitution and reconstruct the government so as to unite church and state and subordinate the latter, the state, to the former, the church, by putting an end to all religious differences and establishing the religion of the Pope, whatever that is or may be, as the national religion. There's the purpose of this New World Order. That's the purpose of all the difficulties we see coming from the federal government today. They're now under the extreme pressure applied by this fifth column in the United States, which are not only card-carrying Roman Catholics dedicated to the Pope, but they now include all the ecumenical evangelibellies that joined Vatican Council II, that signed agreements with the papacy to do all in their power to unite Christians. They're going to make America Catholic by law, by first overthrowing our Constitution, then uniting church and state, and then making this a quote-unquote Christian nation, when in fact it's not Christianity at all. It is Roman Catholicism. It is popery. You know, I suggest when this is all over that they change the name of this country, not to America, but Romerica. Romerica. He says, but Cardinal Pesci, now Leo XIII, expressed himself more plainly and emphatically upon these points in assigning the reasons why the Pope should possess and exercise throughout the world this extraordinary spiritual sovereignty. It is necessary, he said, in order that the Pope may be empowered, quote, to keep off schism to prevent the spread of public heresies, to decide religious disputes, to speak freely to rulers and to peoples, to send nuncios and ambassadors, to conclude concordats, to employ censures, yes, to employ censures, that is, economic sanction and physical sanction. The Inquisition is what he's referring to here. To employ censures, to regulate, in fact, the consciences of 200 millions of Catholics scattered all over the earth, to preserve inviolate dogmas and morals, to receive appeals from all parts of the Christian world, to judge the causes thus submitted, to enforce the execution and the sentences pronounced, to fulfill, in one word, all his duties, and to maintain all the sacred rights of his primacy, unquote. Having thus enumerated these extraordinary powers of the Pope, such as exist nowhere else in the world, he goes a step further by defining the relations between the papacy and those governments and peoples that have taken away or refused to recognize the existence of these powers. In this he refers primarily to the Kingdom of Italy, which had committed the offense of abolishing the temporal power of the Pope and separated church and state. And secondly, to all other governments throughout the world where the union between church and state is forbidden, that is, where governments of, for, and by the people have been established. Quote, here then, he says, is what they are aiming at by taking from the Pope his temporal power. They mean to render it impossible for him to exercise his spiritual power, unquote. Pope's got it figured out. We separated church and state. We don't want him to be a king over us, and we don't want him to be a priest over us either. Or rather, the Protestants of that day did not want him to be a king over us or a priest over us. We wanted Christ to be our king and Christ to be our priest. That's why we separated church and state. The Pope's got it absolutely right. We denounce the temporal power of the Pope because we denounce his spiritual power. He is nothing to us but Antichrist. The Pope's got it figured out. The attacks upon his temporal sovereignty in the world are to destroy his spiritual sovereignty as well and place him in the pit where he belongs. That is, up until the time of Vatican Council II, of course. Now we want him to be a king and a priest. You know, I liken Vatican Council II as the same as the Israelites that God miraculously delivered out of Egyptian bondage. Led them across dry land over the Red Sea, fed them, watered them, kept them cool in the daytime and warmed them by night, gave them the law, gave them grace, and they wanted to go back to Egypt. You know what? The Protestant Reformation was our deliverance from the Pharaoh in Rome. It was miraculous. The Protestant Reformation returned to true biblical Christianity. But now Christians want to go back to Pharaoh. History is repeating itself. We learn nothing from the Jews. We learn nothing from the Israelites. We can read the Bible, all that history, and yet we've repeated it ourselves. We've repudiated our deliverance from Pharaoh and wish to return. Says, here then, says he, is what they are aiming at by taking from the Pope his temporal power. They mean to render it impossible for him to exercise his spiritual power, unquote. This goes to the bottom of the question, says R.W. Thompson, and states plainly the idea present in his mind. That is, that the spiritual power, being superior to the temporal, necessarily includes it to the extent he shall think proper to assert, limited only by his pontifical discretion, so that the latter must be to the extent must to that extent be kept in subordination to the former and obey its commands. For example, the Pope considers it his duty to send an army of ecclesiastics to all parts of the world and to exact from them explicit obedience to himself, so that wheresoever they shall find temporal laws forbidding them to perform their spiritual functions as he shall define them, he and they must be endowed with sufficient spiritual power to enable them to disobey those laws and set them aside when it becomes expedient to do so. He assumes that, quote, every Catholic, no matter where he is, accepts this as part of his religious faith, being instructed that the Pope must possess such power over both spirituals and temporals as shall make him independent of every government upon the earth in all such matters as he shall declare to be within his spiritual jurisdiction. Quoting some obscure lodge of Carbonarism in Italy, in order to show that where the Pope does not possess the power he claims for him, irreligion, infidelity, and immorality must of necessity prevail. He declares that, quote, it is no longer matter of policy, it is matter of conscience, to remove out of the way all impediments to papal supremacy, and that every Christian must stand by the Pope in order to put down the enemies of religion, who are designated by him to be those who have taken away from the Pope or deny to him any or all of the above enumerated powers. He does not fail to make his denunciation as comprehensive and sweeping as possible by characterizing as irreligion and libertinism the progressive advancement of modern nations, which prevail where church and state have been separated. He attaches this character to all these because, according to him, they are not faithful to Christ, or to the Church, or to the Pope. He denounces the revolution in Italy as, quote, the result of conspiracy, deception, injustice, and sacrilege, unquote, merely because it abolished the temporal power of the Pope, without the least impairment of any single principle of religious faith that can be traced back to Christ, to the apostles, or to the primitive Christians. What seemed to him to be one of its deplorable and most odious consequences was the loss of power by the Pope in consequence of the provision which placed the clergy upon an equality with other citizens in regard to civil duties and rights, and made them responsible to the laws of the state precisely as they are in the United States. Yeah, what really sticks in his craw is that his priests are made to abide by the laws of the land. We'll be back right after the messages.
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find. But investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you appreciate Inquisition Update and would like to see it stay on the network, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you wish to contact me, please do so by writing email at tom@seawaves.us. That's tom@seawaves.us. Now, what seemed to Pope Leo XIII to be one of the most deplorable and most odious consequences of the separation of church and state was the loss of power by the Pope in consequence of the provision which placed the clergy, the Roman Catholic clergy, upon an equality with other citizens in regard to civil duties and rights, and made the priest responsible to the laws of the state, precisely as they are in the United States. Now that church and state are separated, the priests have to go by the laws of the land. And the Pope says this is an imposition upon his spiritual and temporal power. It's unlawful. It's a violation of Roman Catholic canon law, which says the priests are alter Christos, other Christs, and are above the law. You wonder where the attitude of being above the law comes from? You see it emulated, even among the citizenry, but especially, and nowhere more so than the governors of the world. They're above the law. Why are they above the law? Because they serve the church, not the state. They come under the they become sacrosanct. They share the divine will with the Pope. They are in his service. They are his priests, as it were. And the laws simply don't apply. This is why we can't bring a pedophile priest to justice anywhere in the world. And this is why we can't bring our legislators to justice either. George W. Bush, perpetrator of 9/11, you and all your papal hordes in Washington, D.C. that you surrounded yourself with, this is why the American people can't bring you to justice, because you're above the law. And what did you accomplish by 9/11? Another papal crusade, pitting this, according to the Pope, this heretical nation against another heretical nation. Who won on 9/11? The Pope, the lawless one, the one who controls our government and the governments of the Arabs, the Muslims. I hope my listeners don't think that I've just shifted gears. I've demonstrated to you the lawlessness that R.W. Thompson is informing us that comes as a result of the union of church and state. When church and state are united, they both become sacrosanct and above the law. And they can commit biblical scale atrocities without tinge of conscience. It's all about making the Pope the king of the world. That's why the United States fights all these wars. We've seen right before our eyes the result of this lawlessness, this union of church and state. Do we want more of it? We have to denounce the union of church and state. We have to denounce the Pope as Antichrist. And our government, for as much as it emulates the papacy and worships the papacy, it too is Antichrist. He says this is the point upon which neither the Pope nor the clergy will compromise. Otherwise than upon compulsion. The Pope and his priests and the government of the United States are not going to compromise unless by compulsion, unless they are forced. He says, with them there is no heresy more flagrant than compelling the clergy to comply with any law requiring them to do what the Pope forbids as prejudicial to the church. The right of the Pope to require of them disobedience to any such law, and their right to disobey it, is what they call independence, which according to them cannot be impaired without violating the divine law. They submit to this in the United States, and wheresoever church and state are separated, but always with the unchangeable purpose of securing in the end complete triumph for the law of the church over that of the state. Hence, when, as the result of the revolution, the law of Umbria placed the Roman Catholic clergy upon an equality with other citizens and made them responsible to the laws of the state as they are now in the United States, it was denounced by the present occupant of the papal chair as sacrilegious violation of the divine law. Is this requirement any less sacrilege in the United States than in Umbria? The degrees of latitude and longitude do not vary the meaning of divine law, but the difference in conditions may account for simulated acquiescence in the one case and open protest in the other. He saw also in the diffusion of pestilential books of erroneous doctrines and heterodox teachings, in other words, Protestant books, another cause for pontifical curse, insomuch as it impaired the power of the Pope to place restrictions upon the freedom of the press, which has opened the way to liberalism and made the crowns of kings insecure. You see, that's what Protestant books do. They make the Pope, his priests, and his presidents insecure. That's what Protestantism does, because it puts them under the law of God, which is no respecter of persons. That's the justice of God's holy law. It is no respecter of persons, no respecter of popes, no respecter of priests, and no respecter of presidents and kings. There's no such thing as the sanctity of the Pope, the sanctity of the Roman Catholic Church, or the sanctity of the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope, or the sanctity of government. No respecter of persons. Everyone's held to account. Everyone must repent of their sins and accept Christ, and Him only should we serve. He says, but that which he condemned more than all and considered the source of innumerable ills was the fact that church and state were separated and each confined to its own distinct and independent sphere. Referring to the law of Umbria, which required the Roman Catholic clergy to accept this, as the clergy in the United States are required to accept it, he says, quote, they are offered as the basis of reconciliation to accept the condemned and false system of the separation of church and state, which, being equivalent to divorcing the state from the church, would force Catholic society to free itself from all religious influence, unquote. He manifestly intended to impress the minds of all who acknowledged obedience to the Pope, whether in Europe, in the United States, or elsewhere, with the sentiment that the only true religion in the world required, as a matter of religious faith, that church and state should be united, with the latter subordinate to the former in whatsoever concerns faith and morals, and that where they have been separated, their union should be restored. Having thus made this the solemn religious duty of every Roman Catholic throughout the world, he has thereby placed himself and is preparing them to be placed, when the proper time shall arrive, in direct hostility to the principles which prevail in all modern liberal governments, including that of the United States. You see the government of the United States being overthrown? Do you see the nature of the government of the United States being changed? Your first suspicion should be the Pope and the papists in this country, the priests, the shadow government of the United States, the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, and every member of that church, whether he be a card-carrying Roman Catholic or an ecumenical evangeli-belly. They are the ones that are overthrowing the Protestant constitutional republic of this country and making America Catholic. He says, in all this there was no disguise, nothing equivocal, nor is there any reason why there should have been, inasmuch as these admonitions were addressed to a population reared and educated in the faith of the Church of Rome, for centuries obedient to the commands of the Pope and its clergy, and in whose minds there was supposed to linger such sentiments of reverence for the papacy as would, if vigorously appealed to, stimulate them to demand the restoration of the temporal power of the Pope. Therefore, the foremost man among the clergy, he whose eloquence stirred the hearts and whose virtues were universally acknowledged, was chosen as the champion of the papal cause. But for events which have subsequently occurred, more especially his election to the pontificate, and the tolerant spirit which pervades our institutions, it is not probable they would ever have reached the people of the United States. And even now, since they have done so in the Pope's biography, there are scarcely 5 out of every 100,000 of our population who will ever read them, or if they do, will turn aside from the multitude of their pursuits to investigate to investigate and scan them closely enough to discover the true meaning plainly and fairly as it is expressed. By such investigation and discovery, they would see that Pope Leo XIII considers the following propositions irrevocably settled as religious dogmas: that God provided for the Italian people a form of civil government subject to the absolute dominion of the Pope, as the only one that they can be religiously tolerated; that revolution to set it aside and establish a popular and constitutional form of government in its place violates the law of God and is heresy; that self-government by the people is an abomination which can never obtain the sanction and approbation of the papacy; and that the people of Italy, in order to maintain faithful to the Church, should continue forever obedient subjects of this imperial absolutism, no matter how severe its oppressions may become, or how much they may desire to rid themselves and their children of it. And it will be observed that the condition of Italy in rebellion against the temporal absolutism of the Pope serves him to illustrate the principle which lies at the bottom of all his reasoning, that as God governs the world in equity and has provided this imperial absolutism for that purpose, with the Pope to preside over all that is spiritual and whatsoever temporal shall involve spirituals, therefore all other forms of government are founded upon, quote, irreligion and libertinism, unquote, especially such as make the whole body of the people the source of civil power. In Roman Catholic canon law, the people are not to govern, but are to be governed by the voice of God, the Pope. He says the integrity of Pope Leo XIII is not questioned by anyone, but he might be liable to the suspicion of insincerity if he had been personally enabled to contrast the present improved condition of the people of the United States, which has been reached within little more than a century of time, with that of the peoples who have for more than 1,200 years been compelled to submit to the authority and spiritual dominion of the papacy. At all events, it is difficult for minds impressed by the influences of free popular government to appreciate either the force or merits of his arguments when he attempts to make the temporal indispensable to the spiritual power, and asserts the divine right to maintain it when possessed, and the duty of acquiring it when not possessed, as equally indispensable parts of religious faith. The fact that the Italian people, otherwise devoted to the Roman Catholic Church, repudiated this doctrine both politically and religiously should have impressed his mind with its want of adaptability to the present condition of the world, distinguished as it is either by some form of progress or the popular desire for it among all the nations. Yet, instead of coming to some terms with this progressive spirit among the Italians, which needed only acquiescence in the loss of the temporal power, he was constrained by the united pledge of the College of Cardinals at the time of his election to persist in the protesting and the aggressive policy of his immediate predecessor, Pope Pius IX. And as he could not turn back without an entire abandonment of the temporal power, he has been likewise constrained to define the extent to which his power, if restored, must be recognized as a matter of religious faith beyond Rome and the states of the Church, that is, over the whole world. Without this, the faithful would have been left to suppose that the restoration was designed only to force an absolute temporal monarch upon the people of Italy without their consent, and therefore that no religious motive for it existed. Consequently, he defined the universal faith to be that by the restoration of the temporal power, the Pope would become again so absolutely sovereign and independent of all governments that he could not, quote, be placed under the jurisdiction of the civil authority, unquote, anywhere in the world, so that whatsoever he shall command in his mission of guiding humanity, as it is called, he must be obeyed, no matter what any civil authority may provide to the contrary. That is, that the laws of every state, in conflict with such religious dogmas as the Pope shall announce, must become void and inoperative insofar as they may impede the measures directed by him. Entering upon particulars, he does not shrink from responsibility of declaring, as we have seen, that the Pope must have power to prevent schism and heresy, which includes the means necessary to suppress them, that is, to put an end to Protestantism and all that it has produced. He alone must decide religious disputes, and every question involving dogmas and morality, and what he shall determine concerning all these must direct and guide the consciences of all the faithful throughout the world. And he shall have the right to enforce the execution of whatsoever judgment he shall pronounce, no matter whether against governments, communities, or individuals. The word enforce in his own, evidently employed with a full understanding of its import. For the completeness of his style shows that it is not his habit to waste words or to use them without deliberation. He could not have intended to resort to force as a primary remedy against heresy, but probably considers it justifiable when circumstances render it necessary, as in the case of rebellious and abjurate heretics, whose defiance of papal authority becomes flagrant. It is desirable, however, to follow him further in order to become entirely familiar with the practical working of his doctrines as he himself applied them to the state of affairs with which he was directly concerned in carrying on the battle with irreligion and the revolution. When the archbishops and bishops of Umbria deemed it proper to protest to the Piedmontese government against its infringement of papal rights, Cardinal Pecci was chosen by them as especially fitting for that delicate and important work. As the population of Piedmont were Roman Catholic, and there had been no attempt on the part of the government to intervene to interfere with what they considered the established faith of the Church upon strictly religious points, this protest was mainly intended to express opposition to the laws which regulated the relations of the clergy to the state by requiring them to obey the public statutes as they are required here to do in the United States and in such countries as have disunited church and state. Up till that time, they had been an exclusive and independent class. The Roman Catholic priests up until that time in Umbria were an exclusive and independent class, sacrosanct, untouchable by the government, with privileges and prerogatives not enjoyed by the mass of citizens, such as exemption from taxes and from the support of the government. And to the change in these relations this protest was intended to imply, the laws then existing were considered an irreligious invasion of the liberty of the Roman Catholic clergy, that is, of their right of exemption from all governmental obligations. Consequently, the feeling upon the subject became very intense among the clergy, as was to be expected after so many years of license and indulgence. And it furnished Cardinal Pecci with the opportunity of making an admirable display of his intellectual powers and eloquence. Without preface, he came to the question directly in these words, quote, It is a grievous error against Catholic doctrine to pretend that the church is the subject of any earthly power and bound by the same economy and relations which regulate civil society. The church is not a human institution, nor is it a portion of political edifice, although it is destined to promote the welfare of the men among whom it lives. It affirms that from God came directly its own being, its constitution, and the necessary faculties for attaining its own sublime destiny, which is one different from that of the state, and altogether of a supernatural order. Divinely ordered, with a hierarchy of its own, it is by its nature independent of the state." Unquote. There you see expressed by this Cardinal Pesce, soon to become Pope Leo XIII, describing the sacrosanctness of the Roman Catholic Church and its clergy and the Pope. Wholly above the law. A divine institution, they say. It's not a man-made institution when history makes it utterly unquestionable, the human institution of the papacy, or rather the satanic institution of the papacy, and the Roman Catholic Church and its clergy. He's Antichrist. He should be made subject to the laws of the land and to God's holy law. He should submit to the universal authority of heaven, Christ the righteous. R.W. Thompson continues, he says, he makes the whole superstructure of his argument rest upon the foundation that as the Constitution and all the faculties of the Church came from God, therefore it must be of necessity, it must have a hierarchy of its own and entirely independent of the state. That is, the clergy must be bound to obey the Pope and released from all obligation to obey the laws of the state, unless they also shall be approved by the Pope. There's your union of church and state. A whole world united under Antichrist. That's the goal of the papacy. That's the goal of the Jesuits. But before that can happen, Protestantism must be destroyed. That's what they're doing all over the world, and nowhere more so than the United States.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.